In the early years after the birth of Islam, a quiet movement began to grow inside the larger faith. It was a movement that cared more about the inner life of the heart than about outward rules alone. Those who followed this path looked for a direct, personal feeling of the divine. The story of that movement is often called the story of Sufism. It started in the first few centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, when the Muslim world was expanding from the desert of Arabia to cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and Kufa. In those bustling places, people from many cultures met, traded ideas, and shared stories. At the same time, some seekers turned away from the crowds and went into the desert, where the silence allowed them to hear the voice inside. One of the first names that appears in the history of this inner path is Hassan al-Basri. He lived in the city of Basra in the mid-600s. He was known for his deep fear of God and his simple way of speaking. A story often told about him describes how a young man asked him for a secret to closeness with God. Hassan answered, "The heart is a mirror. Keep it clean." He meant that the mind must be free of selfish thoughts, just as a clean mirror shows a clear image. This short saying became a guiding line for many later mystics. Another early figure is Rabia al-Thabawiyah, a woman from Basra who lived a little later, in the early 800s. Rabia is famous for saying that love for God should not be tied to any hope of reward. She is recorded as saying, "I love God for his own sake, not for what he gives." In her life, she gave up all worldly comforts, choosing instead a simple room, a few pieces of bread, and a constant prayer. Her story shows that the early path was not limited to men. Women also walked the same inner road. To picture how this inner road grew, imagine a garden in spring. A few seeds are scattered on the soil. At first they are hidden, but with water and sunshine they push up tiny shoots. In time the garden fills with many plants, each different, but all rooted in the same earth. The early mystics were like those seeds. They began as a few scattered seekers, and as they shared their experience, the garden of inner devotion spread across the Muslim world. A second picture can help. Think of a river that leaves its source and looks for the easiest way down a mountain. It does not force a straight line. It bends around rocks, finds valleys, and eventually joins the sea. The early Sufi seekers were like that river. They followed the path that felt most natural to the heart, sometimes moving into deserts, sometimes gathering in city houses, always looking for the smooth way to the divine. One historical anecdote tells of a small group of mystics who left the city of Kufa and walked into the empty desert of Najd. They set up a simple camp, lit a fire, and spent their nights in silent prayer. One night, a fierce sandstorm rose. The wind tore at their tents, but the mystics held fast, chanting the name of God. When the storm passed, the desert was quiet again, and the seekers felt a deeper sense of trust. This story is often told to show how the early mystics used hardship as a teacher. Another anecdote comes from the bustling city of Baghdad in the early 800s. A man named Abu al-Fadl al-Baghdadi opened a small house where travelers could sit, drink tea, and talk about the love of God. He invited poets, scholars, and ordinary folk. Word spread, and soon a circle of seekers gathered there each evening. They sang simple verses, shared stories, and practiced a form of remembrance called dhikr, which means remembrance. This early circle became a model for many later Sufi lodges, known as khanqahs. The spread of these circles in Baghdad helped the inner path move from the desert into the heart of the city. The early ideas of this inner path were not accepted by everyone. One common doubt was that the focus on personal feeling might lead people away from the clear teachings of the Quran. A scholar named al-Jahiz, who lived in the 800s, wrote that those who claimed to see God with the heart were the heart walking on thin ice. He feared that such claims could become fantasies rather than real guidance. Another criticism came from some religious leaders who worried that the inner path could turn into heresy, a belief that strays from true doctrine. They argued that the early mystics sometimes used poetry and symbols that could be misunderstood. They said that worship should stay close to the words of the prophet, not be wrapped in vague images. These concerns made some rulers ask the mystics to explain their practices. In response to these doubts, the early mystics gave simple answers. Hassan al-Basri said that the heart's clean mirror still reflects the Quran, it only removes the dust of ego. Rabia answered that love for God does not replace the law. It adds a deeper feeling that makes the law alive. Their replies showed that the inner path saw itself as a complement, not a replacement, to the outward practice. The early movement also offered practical lessons for everyday life. A farmer who tended his field could use the idea of the clean heart to keep his thoughts pure, so that his work would be honest. A merchant who traveled far could remember the river analogy, letting his actions flow smoothly with honesty instead of forcing a hard path. In both cases, the inner teachings helped people act with kindness and patience. Modern scholars look back at these early stories and see them as the roots of many later Sufi orders, such as the Qadiriyya and the Chishtiya. They note that the simple sayings of Hassan and Rabia still appear in modern books, in music, and in poetry. In contemporary classrooms, a teacher might ask students to write a short poem about the heart as a mirror, echoing Hassan's line. In a modern city, a group might meet in a coffee shop to practice dhikr, repeating the name of God in a calm rhythm, just as the early Baghdad circle did. These modern scenes show how the early seeds keep growing. When the video later moves to the section on practice, the listener will hear how the early ideas turn into daily rituals. The practice of dhikr, the use of simple poetry, the habit of sitting in silence, all trace back to the desert retreat and the Baghdad house. The early stories give a picture of why those practices feel natural to many people today. To bring the ideas home, consider two everyday examples. First, a child learning to ride a bike must keep balance, not by forcing the bike to stay still, but by letting the wheels find the right path. That balance is like the river finding its way, a lesson the early mystics used to explain how the heart should move toward God without force. Second, a kitchen garden that needs regular watering shows how the heart needs regular prayer. If the garden is ignored, weeds grow. If it is tended, flowers bloom. The early mystics taught that prayer is the water for the inner garden. The story of the early inner path also includes a simple quote from the Quran that the mystics loved. Indeed, in the remembrance of God do hearts find peace. This line reminded them that the inner calm comes from remembering the divine, not from fighting the world. The mystics used that line to answer critics who said that inner focus was selfish. They said that a peaceful heart helps the whole community. Another quote comes from a poem attributed to Rabia. My heart is a candle. The wind may blow, but the flame stays. She used the candle image to show that love for God can stay bright even when life is hard. This image appears in many later poems and songs, showing how a simple picture can travel through centuries. In the early centuries, the spread of the inner path was helped by trade routes. Travelers from Persia, Egypt, and Spain carried stories of desert mystics to new lands. A merchant from Khorasan once stopped in Baghdad, heard the dhikr circle, and later told his friends in Samarkand about it. Within a few decades, a small group in Samarkand began to meet, using the same simple prayers. This shows how the early circles acted like seeds carried on the wind, finding new soil. The desert retreat also taught a lesson about simplicity. One story tells how a mystic named Sal al-Tarjuman lived alone in a cave for 3 years. He survived on dates and water, and spent his time in silent prayer. When a traveler found him, the mystic said, "The world is a market. I have no need to buy anything." This line showed that the inner path valued inner wealth over material gain. It also gave a clear answer to the criticism that mystics were lazy. They chose a simple life to focus on the divine, not to avoid work. Critics sometimes claimed that the early mystics were too emotional, that they let feelings rule over reason. In response, a later teacher named al-Ghazali wrote that reason and feeling are like two wings of a bird. He used the earlier sayings of Hassan to illustrate that a clean heart still needs the mind to guide it. Though al-Ghazali belongs to a later period, his words echo the early balance between outward law and inner love. The early movement also left a mark on art. Simple calligraphy that writes the name of God, known as the beautiful name, became a way to keep the heart focused. A potter in Baghdad might paint the name on a vase, reminding users of the divine while they eat. This practice shows how the inner path entered daily objects, making the sacred part of ordinary life. When the video later talks about the different Sufi orders, it will be clear that each order took the early ideas and gave them a name. The Qadiriyya, for example, often repeats the story of Hassan al-Basri as a model of humility. The Chishtiya in India tells the story of Rabia's love as a guide for devotion. Both orders keep the same simple core: a clean heart, a steady river, a garden that needs water. In summary, the birth of the inner path in the first centuries of Islam began with a few seekers who wanted to feel God directly. They used simple images like mirrors, gardens, and rivers to explain their ideas. They faced doubts about mysticism and accusations of heresy, but answered with clear sayings that linked inner feeling to the outer law. Their stories spread from desert caves to city houses, from Baghdad to distant lands, and their sayings still echo in modern practice. The next part of the video will show how those early seeds grew into daily rituals, music, poetry, and community gatherings that many people still find comfort in today. The idea of divine oneness, called Tawhid, sits at the heart of Sufi thought. It says that God is not just a ruler among many, but the single source of everything that exists. In simple terms, all of the world is like a candle flame that has joined the bright light of the sun. The candle no longer keeps its own shape, it simply becomes part of the great sun. In the same way, a single melody that blends into a choir loses its separate sound and becomes one voice in the whole song. This picture helps the listener see how Sufis understand the relationship between the human heart and the divine. Ibn Arabi, a famous mystic from the 12th century, wrote that the whole universe is a mirror that reflects the one reality. He used the phrase, "The wrong one is the only reality, and all else is its manifestation." In his own words, "There is no existence except the existence of the one, and all names are but signs of that existence." Al-Ghazali, who lived a few centuries earlier, also spoke of this unity. He said, "The believer sees the world as a single garment, and God as the thread that holds it together." Both thinkers tried to show that the many forms we see are just different shades of the same light. The story of a debate in the court of Caliph al-Mansur gives a vivid picture of how this idea was tested in real life. The Caliph invited a group of scholars to discuss whether the Quran should be read as a literal book or as a guide to the deeper reality of Tawhid. One scholar, a strict literalist, argued that any claim that God is world blurs the line between creator and creature. He warned that such talk could lead people to think that the world itself is divine. The other side was represented by a Sufi master who answered, "When the candle meets the sun, the flame does not become a second sun. It simply disappears into the greater light." The court listened, and the Caliph praised the analogy, noting that the debate showed how the idea of unity could be spoken in everyday terms. A second anecdote comes from a poet named Rumi's early teacher, Shams Edaris, who wrote a heartfelt letter to the ruler of his city. In the letter he wrote, "Your palace is like a garden of roses, but the scent that reaches the world comes from the single rose of the divine." He asked the ruler to see his own power as a reflection of a higher power, not as an isolated source. The ruler replied with a brief note that he would consider the counsel. This exchange illustrates how the concept of tawhid was used not only in scholarly debates, but also in personal political communication. The poet's gentle language made the idea feel close to home, showing that the unity of being could guide both inner practice and public life. To understand how tawhid works in daily life, imagine a child holding a small lantern in a dark room. The child's lantern gives light, but the light is still part of the larger night sky. The child feels the glow, yet the glow is not separate from the darkness around it. In the same way, a person who feels love for another person is actually feeling a spark of the one love that flows from the divine source. The feeling is real, but it points back to the single source that makes all feelings possible. One common objection comes from literalist scholars who read the Quran as a strict legal text. They argue that saying God is one means only that there is one God, not that everything is part of God. They fear that the Sufi view could blur the line between worship and idolatry. Their concern is that if a person says the world is God, it might lead people to worship the world itself. This objection stresses the need to keep the distinction clear, and it has been a strong voice in many theological discussions. A second counterargument is offered by philosophers who follow the Greek tradition. They ask whether the claim that all is one can be proved by reason. They point out that if everything is one, then the differences we see, like fire and water, good and bad, would lose meaning. They argue that the world seems to have real opposites, and that a claim of total unity might ignore the evidence of conflict and change. These thinkers ask for logical support, not just poetic images. Sufi writers answer the literalist concern by reminding listeners that tawhid does not erase the law. They say the law is a map that helps travelers reach the sun, while the sun itself is the destination. The map stays useful even though it is not the sun. In this way, the legal rules guide the heart toward the one reality without becoming the reality themselves. The philosopher's critique is met with the idea that reason can point toward the sun, but the heart must feel the warmth. The Sufi says, the mind can see the outline of a circle, but only the heart can feel its center. This response shows that both reason and feeling have a place in understanding unity. Real-world examples help the viewer see how tawhid shapes actions. A farmer who sees his field as an expression of the divine will tend the soil with gratitude, believing that each seed is a small gift from the same source that gives rain. When the harvest is good, he thanks the one, not just the weather. Another example comes from a doctor who treats patients. If the doctor sees each patient as a reflection of the same divine light, the care becomes an act of worship. The doctor's skill is not just a job, but a way to honor the unity that lives in everybody. Modern scholars have taken these old ideas and placed them in new contexts. Some write about popanentheism, a term that means the world is inside God, but God also goes beyond the world. They see this as a modern way to speak about tawhid. Others link the concept to environmental ethics, arguing that if the earth is a manifestation of the divine, then harming it is like harming the one. These interpretations show that the ancient picture of a candle merging with the sun still shines in today's debates about climate and technology. The next part of the video will move from the idea of oneness to the idea of love. Love, in Sufi thought, is the way the heart reaches out to the single source. Knowledge, too, is seen as a path that leads the mind back to the one truth. By understanding Tawhid first, the viewer can see why love and knowledge are not separate topics, but parts of the same journey. To bring the picture home, consider a simple kitchen scene. When a pot of soup is heated, the steam rises and fills the whole room. The steam does not become a new thing. It is simply the water in a new form, moving through the same space. In the same way, when a person's heart opens to the divine, the love that spreads out is not a new kind of love. It is the same love that already exists in the source, just moving through a new shape. The scent of the soup reaches the whole house, just as the scent of divine love reaches every corner of a person's life. Another easy analogy uses a river flowing into the sea. The river keeps its name as it moves, but once it reaches the ocean, it becomes part of the larger water. The river's water does not lose its identity. It simply joins a bigger whole. This image helps the listener see how a person's personal prayers, hopes, and fears can join the greater flow of divine will without disappearing. A quote from Ibn Arabi adds a poetic touch. When the lover looks upon the beloved, the lover's heart becomes the mirror that reflects the beloved's face. This line shows how the seeker's mind can reflect the one reality. Al-Ghazali also wrote, "The heart that knows the one sees no separation between the creator and the created." Both sayings point to the same core idea. The separation we feel is only a veil, and the veil lifts when the heart sees the single source. The story of the court debate also shows how the idea of unity can calm conflict. When the Caliph's advisors argued, the Sufi master's candle analogy helped them see that the law and the love of God could work together. The Caliph later ordered a new school to teach both the legal texts and the mystical teachings, showing that the two paths can grow side by side. The poet's letter to the ruler gives a personal side to the same theme. By calling the ruler's power a single rose of the divine, the poet reminded the ruler that his authority was a gift, not a claim of being above the divine. The ruler's brief reply showed that even a busy leader could pause and think about the deeper meaning of his role. When the viewer hears these stories, the abstract idea of Tawhid becomes a lived experience. It is not just a theory, but a way to look at law, politics, work, and love. The candle, the melody, the river, the soup, and the lantern all point to the same truth. Everything we see is a shade of one light. In the next segment, the discussion will turn to how that single light is expressed through love. The love that Sufis speak of is not just an emotion, but a bridge that connects the seeker to the source. Knowledge will also be explored as a tool that sharpens the mind so it can recognize the one reality behind all forms. By following the path of love and knowledge, the seeker can move from seeing separate pieces to seeing the whole picture. The voice of the video now invites the listener to pause and think about the candle in the dark room. Imagine the small flame, steady and warm, and then picture the sun high above, bright and endless. When the candle's light meets the sun, the flame does not become a second sun. It simply becomes part of the larger blaze. This image stays with the listener, reminding them that every small act, every quiet prayer, is a way to join the greater light. The melody analogy also stays vivid. Hear a single voice singing a simple tune, then hear it join a choir. The single voice does not lose its notes. It adds to the harmony. In the same way, each person's prayer adds a note to the grand chorus of divine love. The chorus is louder, richer, and more beautiful because each voice trusts the same source. The historical anecdotes give the idea a human face. The Caliph's court was a place of power, yet the Sufi master's gentle picture changed the tone of a serious debate. The poet's letter showed that even a ruler could be reminded of his place in the larger picture through simple, heartfelt words. Both stories show that the concept of Tawhid can move kings and scholars alike. The counterarguments remind the listener that not everyone agrees. Literalists fear that the idea blurs the line between worship and idol worship. Philosophers ask for logical proof. The Sufi answers keep the discussion balanced, showing that law and love can coexist, and that reason can point toward the sun while the heart feels its warmth. The modern links show that the old picture still matters. Environmentalists who see the earth as a manifestation of the divine argue for better care. Philosophers who discuss panentheism use the same language of oneness, just with new words. The core idea stays the same. The many are threads in one fabric, even if the fabric is described in different ways today. The examples of a farmer and a doctor bring the idea home. The farmer's gratitude for each seed shows how the everyday act of planting becomes a prayer. The doctor's care for patients becomes an act of honoring the one source that lives in each body. Both illustrate how Tawhid can shape ordinary work into a spiritual practice. The analogies of steam, river, and soup keep the language clear. They use everyday sights that anyone can picture. By linking the abstract idea to a kitchen pot or a river, the script makes the concept easy to hold in the mind. The quotes from Ibn Arabi and al-Ghazali give the voice of the original thinkers. Their words are simple, yet they carry deep meaning. The script repeats them in plain language, so the listener can feel the weight of the original texts without getting lost in old language. The segment ends with a gentle invitation to the story of love in Sufism begins with a simple idea. Love is not just a feeling. It is the engine that moves a seeker forward. It is the wind that pushes a boat across a calm lake. In the language of the mystics, love is called ishq. Ishq means a deep, burning love that reaches beyond the self. It is the same love a child feels for a small pet, a soft cat that curls in a lap. The child does not ask why the cat purrs. The child simply enjoys the warmth and the sound. That simple trust is the first step on the Sufi road. A second picture helps. Imagine a traveler far from home. The traveler walks across deserts, over mountains, through towns that do not feel like home. At night, the traveler looks at the stars and feels a longing that pulls the heart toward a place that is not seen. The longing is a quiet ache, a pull that never lets the traveler rest. In Sufism, that ache is called the longing for the beloved. The beloved is not a person in the ordinary sense. It is the divine, the source of all life. The traveler's heart beats faster when the thought of home appears. In the same way, the seeker's heart beats faster when the thought of the divine appears. The traveler's longing is a model for the Sufi's love. Rumi, the great Persian poet, wrote about this love in many ways. He said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." In simple terms, a hurt can open a door for love. When a person feels pain, the heart can open to the divine. Rumi also wrote, "Love is the bridge between you and everything." That bridge lets a seeker cross from the world of the senses to the world of the spirit. Hafiz, another beloved poet, added, "I am a hole in the universe, and love is the light that fills me." The hole is the empty self, and love is what makes the whole whole. These short verses show how love works as a tool, not just a feeling. The Sufi path uses love in daily practice. In prayer, a seeker may repeat the name of God, called dhikr. Each repetition is a small step toward the beloved. In poetry, love is the main theme. The verses are not just art, they are practice. When a mystic reads a line about love, the heart feels the pull. The practice of love is also seen in ritual. In the whirling dance of the Mevri Vada, the dancer spins like a leaf caught in a soft wind. The spin is a physical act of surrender to love. The dance shows how love can guide the body as well as the mind. A famous story about love in Sufism involves a wine cellar and a mystic. The wine seller set up his stall in a busy market. He called out, "Fine wine, sweet wine, come taste." A mystic passed by, his eyes calm, his steps slow. The mystic stopped and asked, "What do you sell?" The wine seller answered, "Wine that makes the heart forget its worries." The mystic smiled and said, "I have a wine that makes the heart remember the beloved." The wine seller laughed and asked, "How can wine make a heart remember?" The mystic replied, "When the heart drinks love, it forgets the world and remembers the source of all taste." The crowd around them listened. Some laughed, some thought about the words. The story shows that love is like a wine that fills the soul. It is a reminder that love can be a sweet drink that changes the mind. Another tale is the story of a lover's garden. A young man loved a garden that belonged to a friend. The garden was full of roses, lilies, and vines that climbed the walls. The young man visited every day, watering the plants, pulling weeds, and speaking to the flowers. One day he saw a single rose that had not opened. He whispered to the rose, "Open for me, dear rose." The rose stayed closed. The young man did not give up. He kept speaking, kept caring, kept waiting. After many weeks, the rose finally opened, showing a bright red bloom. The young man felt a joy that made his heart sing. He understood that love needs patience, care, and time. The garden became a symbol of the inner self. The seeker must tend the inner garden, waiting for the flower of love to open. These two stories illustrate how love works in Sufi practice. The wine seller story shows love as a drink that changes perception. The garden story shows love as a patient work that brings a bloom. Both stories use everyday images that anyone can picture. They make the abstract idea of ishq feel real. There are also voices that raise concerns about love. One worry is that love can become too much emotion. Some scholars say that if a seeker lets love turn into obsession, the mind may lose balance. They point out that love can make a person act without thought. In a busy market, a person who is too caught up in love might forget to buy food. The same could happen for a mystic who is lost in love and forgets duties. The concern is that love should be guided, not wild. A second counterpoint says that love can distract from duty. A person who works as a farmer must tend the fields. If that farmer spends all his time thinking about love, the crops may wither. Some Sufi teachers remind students that love must be paired with responsibility. They say that love should inspire good work, not replace it. A balanced life uses love as a source of strength, not as an excuse to avoid tasks. These doubts are not ignored in Sufi thought. The mystics answer by showing that love, when true, does not cause neglect. True love includes the care for the world. When a child loves a pet, the child still eats, sleeps, goes to school. The love adds meaning, it does not stop other parts of life. In the same way, a seeker who loves the divine also works, studies, helps others. The love becomes a guide that makes each task more meaningful. The child's affection for the pet shows that love can live with daily chores. The traveler's longing for home shows that the longing can give purpose to the journey, not stop it. Modern thinkers have taken the idea of ishq and put it in new places. Some psychologists speak of self-transcendent love, a love that goes beyond the ego. They compare it to the Sufi idea of losing the self in the beloved. In therapy, they use the image of a traveler longing for home to help patients understand their own yearning for meaning. In art, musicians write songs that echo the language of Rumi and Hafiz. A modern poet may write, "My heart is a compass, pointing to the unseen shore." That line is a nod to the old Sufi images. In popular culture, Movies sometimes show a character who feels a deep pull towards something beyond themselves. That pull is often called destiny or fate. But the feeling is the same as the Sufi longing. The audience can feel the same ache that the mystic feels. The story becomes a mirror for the viewer's own heart. By using familiar scenes, the ancient idea of love as a path becomes easier to see. The practice of love also appears in daily rituals. In the Sufi order of the Qadiriyya, members gather each evening to share a simple meal. While they eat, they speak of love, they read verses from Rumi, they repeat the name of God. The meal is not just food, it is a reminder that love feeds the soul. In the practice of Sama, a listening ceremony, participants sit quietly and listen to music that is meant to open the heart. The music is a tool that carries love into the listener's mind. The ritual shows that love can be expressed in many ways: words, food, sound, movement. An example from history helps to see how love shaped a community. In the 13th century, a Sufi master named Najm al-Din lived in a desert town. He taught his followers that love is the only true law. He told them to treat each other as family, to share water, to help the sick. The town grew from a few tents to a thriving settlement. The people said that love was the reason they survived the harsh desert. Their story shows that love can be a practical force that builds societies. Another historical note comes from the city of Shiraz, where Hafiz lived. Hafiz walked the streets, visited the market, and wrote poems in the coffee houses. He often said that love is a lamp that lights the night. The people of Shiraz loved his verses because they felt the warmth of the lamp in cold evenings. Hafiz's poetry made the city feel more connected. The city's love for his words helped preserve his work for centuries. The anecdote shows that love can travel through words and stay alive in a community. The idea of love as a bridge also appears in a simple analogy. Picture a small child who holds a kite. The child runs, the kite rises, the wind pushes the kite higher. The child's hand is the love that holds the kite. Without that hand, the kite would fall. In the same way, love holds the seeker's spirit and lets it rise toward the divine. The child does not need to understand the physics of wind. The child simply feels the joy of the kite flying. The seeker does not need to understand every mystery of God. The seeker simply feels the joy of love. Another analogy uses a river. A river flows from a mountain to the sea. Along the way it meets rocks, bends, and sometimes slows. The water keeps moving because of a pull toward the sea. The pull is like the longing of the traveler. The river does not stop because it meets a rock. It finds a new path. The seeker, when faced with obstacles, can keep moving because love pulls toward the ultimate goal. The river analogy shows that love can guide through difficulties. In the words of Rumi, "When you are with someone you love, the world seems new." That short line tells that love changes perception. When the heart is open, ordinary things become bright. A cup of tea can taste like a sunrise. A simple walk can feel like a pilgrimage. The Sufi practice tries to keep that sense alive. By repeating the name of God, by reading poetry, by dancing, the seeker trains the heart to stay in that fresh view. The counter-arguments about emotional excess and distraction are also answered by stories. One story tells of a mystic who loved a rose so much that he stayed in the garden all day, ignoring his work. One day the garden was flooded, and the rose died. The mystic was sad, but he learned that love must be balanced with care for the whole garden, not just one flower. He began to tend the whole garden, and the garden flourished. The lesson is that love that focuses on only one thing can become a trap. True love expands to care for all. Another story shows a student who spent all his time in prayer, neglecting his family. His mother grew worried and asked him to help with the household. The student felt torn. He remembered a line from Hafiz. The cup of love is shared, not hoarded. He realized that love must be shared with those around him. He began to help his mother, and his prayer deepened because his heart was full of service. The anecdote shows that love can grow when it is given to others, not kept only for the self. In modern times, people still use the language of love in Sufi gatherings. A group in a city park may sit in a circle, each person holding a candle. They speak of love. They listen to a recording of a knee flute. They repeat a short phrase, Ya Allah, Ya Habibi, which means, O God, O Beloved. The candle flame flickers, reminding them of the light that love brings. The simple act of holding a candle becomes a ritual that shows love as light. The practice of love also appears in the daily life of a student. When the student reads a poem by Rumi, the words may bring a tear to the eye. That tear is a sign that the heart is moving. The student may write the line in a notebook, keeping it close. Later, when the student feels stressed, the line can be read again, and the feeling of love can calm the mind. The simple act of. The story of inner knowledge in Sufism is a story of seeing with the heart rather than with the eyes. In the language of the mystics, the word for this deep seeing is marifa. Marifa means a kind of knowledge that is not learned from books, but that is felt inside, like a warm light that fills the chest. It is a knowledge that does not need a teacher to explain each line. It is a knowing that comes from the soul itself. One way to picture marifa is to imagine a reader who has read a favorite story many times. The reader knows the plot, the characters, the feelings, without needing to open the book. The pages may sit closed, but the story lives inside the mind. In the same way, a seeker of marifa can hold the truth of God in the heart without looking at a text. The heart becomes the page, and the breath becomes the ink. Another picture is the feeling of a stone in the hand. A child who has never seen a stone can still know its shape by touching it. The fingers feel the smooth side, the rough side, the weight. The child learns the stone's form without ever seeing it. Marifa works in a similar way. The heart touches the divine reality, feeling its presence, its shape, its texture. The mind may not name every detail, but the feeling is clear. Al-Kashani, a Persian mystic from the 14th century, wrote often about this inner seeing. He said, "The heart is the seat of knowledge. The eyes are only the doors." In his poem he added, "When the heart looks, the world becomes a mirror of the divine." These lines show that for al-Kashani, the true seeing is not a matter of sight, but a matter of the inner self turning toward the source. Al-Kashani's view did not arise in a vacuum. It grew out of a long line of teachers who spoke of the heart as a guide. The early Sufi master Ibn Arabi wrote, "He who knows the heart knows the hidden." Later, the famous poet Rumi said, "The lamp of the heart burns brighter than any candle." All these voices point to the same idea, that inner knowledge is a kind of light that shines from within. A well-known story from the Persian tradition adds color to this idea. In the city of Shiraz, a master named Safi al-Dawla kept a secret library hidden behind a false wall. The library held scrolls that spoke of the inner path, but the master allowed only those who had already tasted marifa to enter. One night, a young seeker knocked on the hidden door. The master opened it and said, "You have already read the book with your heart. The pages you seek are already in you." The seeker entered, but found no books, only a quiet room and a single candle. The master's lesson was that the secret library was a symbol of the inner vault that each heart carries. Another anecdote tells of a Sufi named Qasim who dreamed of a shining mirror. In his dream, the mirror reflected a bright light that filled the whole room. When he woke, he told his teacher that the mirror was his own heart. The teacher smiled and said, "When the heart is clean, it reflects the light of the one without distortion." This dream became a teaching story that appears in many later texts. It shows how a simple image can convey the deep sense of inner insight. These stories illustrate how Marifa is presented as a personal experience, not a theory. Yet the idea has faced criticism from other thinkers. One common worry is that inner knowledge can lead a person to think they are already perfect, even when they have not changed. This risk is called self-delusion. A jurist named al-Ghazali warned, "If the heart claims knowledge without the guidance of the law, it may become arrogant." He argued that without external checks, a seeker might convince themselves that they have reached the truth while still acting in ways that harm others. Another criticism comes from scholars who stress the importance of external law or Sharia. They claim that a focus on inner feeling may clash with the rules that govern society. One legal scholar, Ibn al-Qayyim, wrote, "The heart may whisper a truth, but the community must follow the law that protects all." He feared that a person who follows only the inner voice could ignore obligations such as honesty, justice, or charity, and cause disorder. These counterpoints do not end the discussion. They add depth to the conversation about Marifa. They ask the seeker to balance inner insight with external responsibility. The balance is a theme that will be explored later in the video, when the practices that keep the heart humble are described. Modern scholars have taken the old ideas and given them new shape. In contemporary philosophy, Marifa is sometimes compared to the concept of phenomenological insight, a term used by thinkers who study how we experience the world directly. They say that just as a scientist can observe a phenomenon without a theory, a mystic can know the divine directly without a book. Yet they also note that such direct knowing must be checked against shared language, otherwise it may become private and isolated. In psychology, the idea of inner knowledge resembles the notion of intuitive wisdom. Researchers have found that people who trust their gut feeling often make good decisions, especially when they have trained that feeling through meditation. The practice of meditation, which many Sufi orders use, helps the heart become still, allowing the inner light to shine clearer. This link between meditation and inner knowing shows how ancient ideas can meet modern science. Two practical examples help illustrate Marifa in everyday life. The first example comes from a market in Istanbul in the 1600s. A carpet seller named Hassan was known for his honesty. One day, a wealthy traveler offered a large sum for a rare rug, but Hassan refused, saying the rug belonged to a neighbor who needed it for his wedding. The traveler asked why Hassan would turn down such profit. Hassan answered, "My heart tells me that the neighbor's joy is more precious than gold." Hassan's decision came from an inner sense of right, not from a rule book. The story is told in a collection of Sufi anecdotes and shows how Marifa can guide simple actions. The second example is from a modern teacher of Sufism in the United States. She leads a group that meets each week to sit in silence and share a short poem. One participant, after months of practice, reported that she could sense the mood of a room without looking at anyone's face. She said, "When I enter a class, I feel the tension or the peace like a temperature." She explained that this feeling helped her respond with kindness, offering a word of comfort when the room was heavy. Her experience reflects the same inner seeing that al-Kashani described centuries ago. Analogies can make the idea even clearer. Think of a radio that picks up a station without needing to read a list of frequencies. The radio's dial is set and the music flows in. The listener does not need to see the numbers on a screen. The song arrives directly. Marifa works like that radio. The heart is tuned and the divine song comes in. Another analogy is a compass that points north without a map. A traveler who trusts the compass can find the way even in a desert. The compass does not show the whole landscape, but it gives a direction that the traveler can follow. In the same way, Ma'rifah gives a direction for the soul, even when the outer world is confusing. Historical notes add depth to the picture. The secret library of the Persian master mentioned earlier was not only a story. Historians have found references to hidden rooms in the homes of mystics, where they kept scrolls that spoke of inner states. These rooms were often sealed with a simple wooden panel, known only to the master and a few trusted students. The secrecy was meant to protect the delicate teachings from being misunderstood by those who were not ready. The library became a symbol of the hidden treasure that each heart carries. The dream of the shining mirror also appears in several written records. In a 13th century manuscript, a Sufi named Ibn al-Fayyaz described a night vision in which a mirror floated above his bed, reflecting a light that seemed to come from nowhere. He wrote, "When I looked into the mirror, I saw not my face, but the face of the beloved." This vision was recorded as a sign that the seeker's heart had become clear enough to reflect divine truth. The story was later used by teachers to illustrate how inner clarity can appear as a bright surface that shows what is beyond ordinary sight. Quotes from primary sources give voice to the tradition. Al-Kashani wrote, "The heart that sees the light does not need the eyes to read the world." Ibn Arabi said, "The true knowledge is the knowledge of the self, for the self is a mirror of the one." Rumi expressed, "When the heart opens, the world becomes a garden of roses." Each of these lines points to the same core idea, that inner knowledge is a direct, lived experience, not a distant theory. The discussion of Ma'rifah also touches on the role of language. Some critics argue that talking about inner knowledge turns a private experience into a public claim, which can be risky. They warn that the language of mysticism can become vague, allowing anyone to claim insight without proof. In response, Sufi teachers often stress humility. They advise the seeker to speak little about the inner light, and to let actions speak louder. This advice is echoed in a saying attributed to the early mystic al-wujud. "The tongue that is silent is the best witness of the heart's truth." Another line of thought comes from modern ethics. Philosophers who study moral psychology note that inner knowledge can be a source of moral intuition. They point out that people often have a gut feeling about right and wrong before they can articulate a rule. This intuition can be shaped by culture, upbringing, and personal reflection. In the Sufi view, the shaping comes from the practice of remembrance, known as dhikr, which repeats the name of the divine. Over time, the repeated remembrance softens the heart, making it more receptive to the inner voice. Later sections of the video will turn to the practices that help develop Ma'rifah. Practices such as silent meditation, breath awareness, and the chanting of divine names are tools that train the heart. The next part will show how a simple breathing exercise can calm the mind, allowing the inner light to become visible. It will also describe how a group gathering for dhikr creates a shared space where each heart can reflect the same light. By linking practice to theory, the video will give viewers a path they can try for themselves. Returning to the question of balance, the risk of self-delusion can. The story of Sufi practice begins with a simple rhythm. In the world of Sufism, the rhythm is called dhikr. Dhikr means remembrance. It is the act of repeating the name of God, a short phrase or a short prayer. The repetition is not a mechanical chant. It is meant to be felt in the heart, like the beat of a pulse. When a heart beats, it sends a signal that keeps the body alive. In the same way, dhikr sends a signal that keeps the spirit alive. The breath follows the chant, the mind follows the breath, and the soul follows the breath. The pattern is steady, and the steady pattern helps the seeker stay present. The early masters of dhikr taught that the practice could be done alone or in a group. Abu Yazid al-Baghdadi, a mystic who lived in the 9th century, wrote about the power of group dhikr. He said that when many voices join together, the sound becomes a wave that can lift the heart. He wrote, "When the tongues of many believers unite, the name of the one rises higher than any single voice could reach." This short line shows how the early mystics saw the practice as a communal lift. In the desert, a group of seekers once gathered under a sky full of stars. The night was cold, and the sands stretched far. The group sat in a circle, each holding a small wooden bowl. They began to chant the name of God together. The sound rose and fell like a tide. The wind carried the chant across the dunes. The desert, which is usually silent, seemed to answer with a soft hum. One of the seekers later wrote, "The night air turned into a living thing, breathing with us as we breathed." This anecdote shows how dhikr can change the feeling of a place, turning a barren desert into a living space. The practice of dhikr is not only a sound, it can also be a silent breath. Some Sufis count the breaths, saying the name of God on each inhale and exhale. Others move their hands in a gentle rhythm, opening and closing the palms like a flower. The movements are simple, but they help the mind stay focused. The simple act of moving the hand while speaking the name of God creates a link between body and spirit. This link is what many Sufi teachers call the heart's memory. The memory does not store facts, it stores feeling. Sama is another key practice. Sama means listening. It is a ceremony of music and poetry. In a Sama gathering, a small group of musicians plays a simple reed flute, a drum, and a small harp. The music is not meant to entertain. It is meant to open the listener's heart. The poetry, often from Rumi or Hafiz, is spoken in a calm voice. The words are simple, but they point to deep truth. A line from Rumi that is often spoken in Sama is, "Rule the wound is the place where the light enters you." The line is short, but it carries a message that the heart can heal when it opens. When the music of a Sama session grows, the participants may begin to sway. The sway is gentle at first, like a tree in a light wind. As the night goes on, the sway can become a slow turn. The turn is not a dance for show. It is a way to let the heart spin toward the divine. The turning is called whirling. Whirling is perhaps the most visible ritual of Sufism. It is the image most people think of when they hear the word Sufi. The first public whirling took place in a city called Konya in the 13th century. The city was a bustling market town. One evening, a group of dervishes, Sufi seekers, set up a small platform in the town square. The crowd gathered, curious about the strange sight. The dervishes began to spin, their long white skirts swirling around them. Their arms were outstretched, one hand pointing to the sky, the other to the earth. The spin was steady, like a child on a playground who has found the perfect speed. The child's laughter is pure, free of worry. The dervish's spin was also pure, free of fear. A local merchant later wrote, "It was as if the wind itself had taken shape and moved among us." The public whirling in Konya showed that the practice could move from a hidden room to a public square, inviting all to witness a living prayer. The image of a child spinning on a playground helps many people understand whirling. A child runs, then lets go, and spins. The child feels the world blur, but also feels a joy that comes from letting go of control. In whirling, the seeker also lets go. The body turns, the mind lets go of ordinary thoughts, and the heart opens to something larger. The spin is not chaotic. It is measured. The seeker keeps a steady pace, like a clock's hand. The steadiness helps the mind stay calm even as the body moves. The practice of whirling also has a simple rule. The dervish keeps one foot on the ground while the other foot pushes. The push gives the spin momentum. The foot on the ground is a reminder of the earth, of the body. The other foot that spins is a reminder of the spirit reaching upward. This balance is why many Sufi teachers say that whirling is a dance of balance between the material world and the spiritual world. Both dhikr and whirling have practical effects on daily life. When a seeker does dhikr regularly, the mind learns to return to a single point. This skill helps in work, in study, and in dealing with stress. A farmer who repeats the name of God while planting seeds can stay calm, and the calm helps the seeds grow. A teacher who does dhikr before a class can speak with a clear voice. The practice builds a habit of focus that spreads beyond the ritual. Whirling also teaches a lesson about community. In a whirling circle, each dervish moves in the same direction. No one steps on another's path. The movement creates a shared space where each person feels the same wind. This shared space builds a sense of belonging. When the circle ends, the participants often hug, sharing a feeling of unity. The feeling of unity is a key part of the ethical teaching of Sufism. The ethic says that every person is a part of the same whole. When a seeker feels this, they treat others with kindness. The ethical side of Sufi practice is often linked to the idea of service. A Sufi who has practiced dhikr may feel a deep love for all beings. This love can turn into action, such as feeding the hungry or caring for the sick. The love is not a feeling that stays inside. It moves outward, like a river that leaves its banks and waters a field. The field then grows, and the river's water has a purpose. In this way, the inner practice becomes outer action. The practice of dhikr also has a side that some scholars have questioned. One concern is that the repeated chanting can become a superstition. Some early scholars worried that people might think the chant itself has magical power, rather than seeing it as a way to focus the heart. They wrote, "When the name is repeated without understanding, the mind may think the sound alone can bring the divine. This worry is a reminder that the practice must stay tied to intention. The intention is the key that turns a sound into a living prayer." Another criticism comes from those who see excess in ritual. Some observers in the medieval period wrote that some dervishes turned the practice into a performance. They said, "When the spin becomes a show for the crowd, the heart loses its quiet." The criticism is not that the practice is wrong, but that it can be used for pride. The early masters warned against this. Abu Yazid al-Baghdadi said, "The true seeker does not seek applause, but seeks the quiet within." The warning reminds seekers to keep the practice humble. The balance between the inner feeling and outer expression is a theme that runs through many Sufi stories. One story tells of a young seeker who traveled to meet a master in a remote mountain village. The master taught the young man to count the breaths while saying the name of God. The young man practiced for weeks, but he felt no change. He asked the master why it seemed not to work. The master smiled and said, "The breath you count is the breath of the world. When you count it, you count the world's breath. The world is always moving. You must also learn to be still while the world moves." The story shows that the practice is not just about the outward act, but about the inner stillness. Another story comes from the time of the first public whirling in Konya. A local baker watched the dervishes spin. He felt curious, but also nervous. After the spin, the baker approached a dervish and asked, "Why do you spin?" The dervish answered, "When the world spins fast, the heart can stay still by moving." The baker laughed, then went back to his shop. He began to hum the same chant while kneading dough. He found that the dough rose better, and his customers felt a calm when they ate the bread. The baker's simple change shows how a public ritual can inspire everyday life. The practice of Sama also includes a special poem that is often repeated. The poem says, "Listen with your heart, not just your ears. This line reminds listeners that the music is a doorway, not the destination. When the music stops, the heart should still be open. The open heart then carries the feeling into daily actions. Modern interpretations of these practices keep the core ideas but use new tools. Some modern Sufi groups use recorded chants that can be played on a phone. The recorded chant can be used during a commute, turning a bus ride into a moment of dhikr. Others use video to show the whirling in a studio, allowing people who cannot travel to a Sufi center to watch and feel a connection. The technology does not change the heart's work, but it makes the practice more accessible. In a university class on religion, a professor once asked students to try a short dhikr session before an exam. The students reported that their nerves calmed, and they could focus better on the questions. The professor noted that the practice helped the students see a link between ancient ritual and modern stress relief. The example shows that the practice can move from a shrine to a classroom. The practice of whirling also appears in modern dance studios. A teacher who studied Sufi whirling taught a class where students spun slowly, focusing on their breath. The students said they felt a sense of balance they had not felt before. The teacher explained that the spin helps the brain learn to handle motion without losing focus. The lesson shows that the ancient practice can teach modern bodies how to stay centered. Both dhikr and whirling have a simple rule that ties them to ethics. The rule is to keep the practice for the inner work, not for fame. When the practice is kept private, it stays a personal prayer. When it is shared, it becomes a way to bring others into the same calm. The balance between private and public is a theme that runs through the whole Sufi path. The community aspect of dhikr is also clear in a story from the desert camp. After a night of chanting, the group broke the fast together. They shared dates and water. The sharing turned the chant into a meal, a moment of love. The act of sharing reinforced the feeling that the chant had created. The story shows how a ritual can lead to a simple act of kindness. The story of the first public whirling in Konya also shows community. The crowd that gathered was not a crowd of critics, but a crowd of curious people. After the spin, many asked the dervishes to teach them the simple steps. The dervishes taught the basics, and the crowd practiced together. The practice turned a public square into a place of shared learning. The lesson is that a ritual can open a space for community growth. In the modern world, some people worry that the chants are super. The story of Sufi ethics begins with a simple act: sharing a meal. When a family invites a traveler to sit at their table, the Sufi sees more than food on a plate. The act becomes a sign of love, a sign of unity, a sign that the world is one family. In the words of al-Tirmidhi, the best of people are those who are most beneficial to others. This saying is repeated in many Sufi circles as a reminder that kindness is the first step on the path. A child who offers a piece of bread to a neighbor learns that the value of a meal lies in the joy it spreads, not in the calories it adds. Another everyday picture appears when a neighbor needs help moving a heavy box. A Sufi would not count the effort as a burden, but as a chance to practice humility. The Prophet is reported to have said, "He who helps his neighbor is like one who helps himself." Al-Tirmidhi records this as a guide for daily conduct. By seeing the neighbor's need as a mirror of one's own, the Sufi learns to treat every small act as a prayer. These simple scenes tie into a larger Sufi belief in love and unity. The heart of Sufi teaching says that all hearts are linked by a single light. When a person feels love for a stranger at a market, that feeling is not a random emotion. It is a glimpse of the deeper truth that all souls share the same source. The Sufi teacher often repeats, "When you love one, you love all." This line appears in many collections and reminds the listener that ethical behavior is a way to feel that unity. One famous historical example shows how a Sufi order turned a market into a place of charity. In the 13th century, the Shadili order set up a bazaar in the city of Fez. The bazaar was not just for buying and selling. It had a special stall where any traveller could receive a warm meal and a blanket. The story goes that a poor farmer arrived with a sack of dates, hoping to sell them. The Sufi keeper of the stall offered the farmer a share of the food and asked him to give the dates to a family in need. The farmer left with a full belly and a heart full of gratitude. The bazaar became known as the charitable market, and people from far away came not just to trade goods, but to see the kindness in action. The tale is recorded in the writings of Ibn al-Arabi, who praised the order for turning commerce into a service to humanity. A second story tells of a Sufi intervening in a local dispute over water rights. In a village near the city of Konya, two families argued over a small spring that fed their fields. The argument grew fierce, and the village risked violence. A wandering dervish, known for his calm presence, arrived and asked each family to bring a cup of water from the spring. He then poured both cups into a single bowl and said, "Water belongs to the earth, not to any one of us. When we share, the earth is happy, and we are happy." The families, moved by the simple act, agreed to share the spring equally. The story appears in the biographies of the poet Rumi, who wrote, "The river does not ask who may drink, it flows for all." This anecdote shows how Sufi ethics can calm a heated conflict by reminding people of a larger unity. These real-world examples illustrate how Sufi teachings move from theory to practice. The core idea is that every act of kindness is a step toward the larger goal of love. When a person shares food, helps a neighbor, or resolves a dispute, they are practicing what the Sufi masters call ihsan, a word that means perfect conduct. Ihsan is not a distant ideal. It is a daily habit that can be measured by the small gestures we make. However, not everyone accepts this view without question. One common counterargument comes from the claim of moral relativism. Critics say that Sufi ethics are based on a particular cultural and religious background, and therefore cannot claim universal truth. They argue that what counts as kindness in one society may look different in another. For example, a culture that values strict hierarchy might see a servant sharing food with a master as a duty, not an act of love. The relativist says that Sufi moral rules are just one set among many, and that imposing them on others would be unfair. In response, Sufi scholars point to the underlying principle of love, which they argue is not limited by culture. They cite the saying of Al-Tamidi, "Whoever loves for the sake of Allah, loves all of humanity." The love mentioned is not tied to a specific tradition, but to a universal feeling that can be felt by anyone, regardless of background. The scholars say that the form of the act may change, but the intention to bring relief and unity stays the same. Thus, they claim that Sufi ethics can adapt without losing their core. A second objection comes from accusations of political involvement. Some historians note that Sufi orders have sometimes aligned with rulers, receiving land or tax privileges. Critics argue that this partnership shows that Sufi ethics are used to legitimize power, not to stay pure. They point to the Ottoman period, when certain Sufi lodges received state support and were asked to help collect taxes. The critics say that this blurs the line between spiritual teaching and political agenda. Supporters of Sufism answer by separating the spiritual message from the actions of individuals. They note that the original teachings warn against using spiritual authority for personal gain. A well-known quote from the mystic Bayazid Bastami, recorded by al-Tamidi, states, "The true seeker does not seek fame, nor does he seek wealth. His heart is a mirror for the divine." When a Sufi order accepts state support, the supporters argue that the order often uses those resources to fund charitable projects, such as the charitable bazaar mentioned earlier. In this view, the political link becomes a tool for greater good, not a betrayal of ethics. The discussion of these counterarguments brings the conversation back to love and unity. If love is the true center, then any use of power must be measured against how well it serves the love of all. The Sufi answer to political criticism is often a simple story. A ruler once asked a dervish whether he should punish a thief. The dervish replied, "Punish the heart that chose theft, not the hand that took the bread." The ruler took this as a reminder that justice must be tempered with compassion. The story is told in many Sufi collections and shows how the ethic of love can guide even political decisions. Everyday life offers many more chances to practice these ideas. A person who sees a child crying on a bus can offer a smile and a seat. A student who notices a classmate struggling with homework can sit together and explain the problem. In each case, the Sufi sees the act as a small mirror of the larger unity. The act is not done to gain praise, but because the heart feels a natural pull toward the other. The saying of al-Tirmidhi, "The one who feeds a hungry person is like one who feeds an entire nation," makes this clear. The Sufi does not keep count of deeds. The heart simply knows that each act adds to the whole. Modern interpretations of Sufi ethics often use these simple stories to teach in schools and community centers. Some teachers use the example of sharing a meal to start a lesson on empathy. Others bring the story of the water dispute to illustrate conflict resolution. In each case, the lesson is not a set of rules, but a feeling that the world works best when people care for each other. Contemporary writers such as Idris Shaikh have written that Sufi ethics are like a gentle wind that cools the heated heart of society. This image replaces the older language of tapestry with a plain picture that anyone can see. The link between ethics and the larger Sufi themes of love and unity is never far away. When a Sufi talks about the beloved, the term can mean God, but it also means the neighbor, the stranger, the animal, the earth. The ethical teachings turn the abstract idea of love into concrete actions. The quote from al-Tirmidhi, "Whoever loves for the sake of Allah, loves all of humanity," acts as a bridge. It tells the listener that love for the divine automatically expands to love for every person. Thus, the moral code is not a list of duties, but a living expression of love. A modern example shows how this works in a city park. A group of volunteers, inspired by a Sufi teacher, set up a free tea stand every Saturday. They invite anyone passing by to sit, have tea, and talk. No money is asked. The volunteers say they are following the Sufi teaching that the cup that is shared is never empty. Over time, the stand becomes a place where people of different faiths, ages, and backgrounds meet. The simple act of sharing tea becomes a small community of unity. The story has been featured in recent articles on urban Sufi movements and demonstrates how ancient teachings can shape present life. Another recent case involves a neighborhood that faced a sudden flood. A local Sufi center organized a relief effort, sending volunteers with blankets, food, and water. The center's leader quoted al-Tirmidhi, "The best of deeds are those that bring relief to the suffering." The volunteers worked side by side with people of other religions, and the relief effort was praised for its humility and speed. The episode shows how the ethical principle of helping a neighbor can expand to help an entire district when the need is great. These stories, both old and new, reinforce the idea that Sufi ethics are rooted in everyday life. They are not abstract theories locked in books. They are habits that can be seen in a market, a courtroom, a kitchen, or a park. The central message remains the same. Love for the divine becomes love for all, and that love shows up in simple deeds. When the narrator returns to the theme of love and unity, the connection becomes clearer. The Sufi says that the world is a single garden, and every person is a flower. If one flower wilts, the garden feels the loss. Therefore, caring for any single flower is caring for the whole garden. This garden image replaces any fancy language and stays easy to picture. It also ties the moral teachings to the larger spiritual picture that the Sufi tradition holds dear. In summary, the moral teachings of Sufism are built on sharing, helping, and resolving conflict with compassion. They draw on sayings of al-Tamidi that stress benefit to others, feeding the hungry, and loving the neighbor. Historical anecdotes like the charitable bazaar of the Shadili order and the water spring dispute show how these ideas have been lived out for centuries. Counter-arguments about moral relativism and political involvement are answered by pointing to the universal feeling of love and the use of resources for good. Modern examples of tea stands and flood relief illustrate that the same principles work today. All of these points lead back to the core Sufi belief that love and unity are the foundation of ethical conduct, and that every small act of kindness is a step toward that deeper unity. Poetry in the Sufi world works like a bridge that lets the reader step from ordinary thought into deeper meaning. It is a gentle way to speak about love, truth, and the hidden side of the self. The verses act like a simple recipe. A cook adds a few basic ingredients, lets them simmer, and then a new flavor appears. In the same way, a poet mixes a few images, a few sounds, and a new sense of reality is revealed. Rumi, the great Persian mystic, shows this clearly. One of his most famous lines reads, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The line is short, but it points to a big idea. It says that pain can become a doorway to wisdom. The poem does not explain the idea directly. It lets the reader feel the truth through the image of a wound and a light. The feeling stays with the heart longer than a plain definition would. Another poet, Attar of Nishapur, uses stories that travel like a caravan across deserts. He wrote a book called The Conference of the Birds. In it, a group of birds set out to find a king, only to discover that the king is themselves. One line says, "The journey of the heart is the path of love." The line is a simple map. It points the reader toward the idea that love is not a place, but a road that the heart walks. The road is full of stops, and each stop holds a lesson. Bulleh Shah, a Punjabi Sufi poet, also writes in a plain style. He says, "I am not a man, I am a lover of love." The phrase drops the need for titles or status. It tells the listener that the true self is found in love itself. The poem does not argue that love is the only truth. It simply shows the speaker's choice. That simple showing is what makes the poetry powerful. These poems act like recipes because they mix familiar things, food, travel, birds, wounds, into a new taste. The reader does not need a philosophy degree to sense the meaning. The images are everyday, but the way they are put together makes the mind notice a hidden flavor. That hidden flavor is often the idea of love as a path to knowledge, a theme that was already spoken about in earlier Sufi teachings. The story of how Rumi met the wandering dervish Shams gives a clear picture of how poetry can open a door. Rumi was a respected teacher in Konya. He spent his days giving talks and writing verses that praised God. One night, a man named Shams appeared in the city. He was known for asking bold questions and for moving from place to place without a home. When Shams entered Rumi's garden, he asked, "What is the purpose of your love?" Rumi answered with a calm smile, "To be close to the beloved." Shams laughed and said, "Then let us walk together in the garden of the heart." The two men talked for hours, and Rumi felt a new fire in his heart. After that meeting, Rumi's poetry changed. He began to write verses that spoke of a love that could not be held in words, only felt. The meeting shows how a simple conversation can turn a scholar into a poet whose words become a bridge for many. A second anecdote shows how Attar's stories moved along trade routes. In the 12th century, merchants traveled from Persia to India, carrying silk, spices, and books. One merchant named Farid bought a copy of the Conference of the Birds in a market in Nishapur. He read the story on his long caravan rides across the desert. At each stop, he shared the tale with other travelers. The story of the birds looking for the simur, a mythical bird, spread like a scent carried on the wind. By the time the caravan reached the ports of the Indian Ocean, local poets were already retelling the story in their own language. The spread shows how poetry can travel far, carrying ideas of love and unity across cultures. The story also shows how a simple narrative can become a shared treasure among many people. These two anecdotes illustrate how poems act as bridges. One bridge is built by a personal meeting that sparks a new inner fire. The other bridge is built by trade routes that carry stories across lands. Both bridges let ideas move from a quiet mind to a bustling world. The use of symbols in Sufi poetry is not random. A rose, for example, can stand for the beauty of the divine. A nightingale can stand for the soul that sings for the beloved. When a poet writes, "The nightingale sings for the rose, yet the rose does not hear," the line points to a deeper truth. The soul longs for the divine, but the divine is beyond ordinary hearing. The symbol lets the reader feel the gap without a long argument. The symbols also link back to earlier ideas of love and knowledge. In Sufi thought, love is the path that leads to true knowledge. Knowledge is not just facts. It is the light that shines inside. When a poet writes, "The lamp of love lights the heart's dark room," the image ties love and knowledge together. The lamp is love, the light is knowledge, and the dark room is the inner self that needs illumination. The poem shows the link without a formal lecture. There are, however, two common objections to using poetry in this way. The first objection is that poetry can be misread. Because symbols are open, a reader might take a rose to mean a flower in a garden, not a sign of divine beauty. In that case, the deeper idea is lost. Some scholars warn that without a guide, the poem can lead the reader away from the intended meaning. They argue that a teacher should explain the symbols, so the reader does not wander into wrong ideas. The second objection is that some people call Sufi poetry frivolous. They see verses about love and wine as light entertainment, not serious philosophy. They claim that the poems do not address real problems and that they distract from the hard work of study. This criticism often comes from those who value strict logic over feeling. They say that poetry is too soft to hold the weight of truth. Both objections have merit, but they also miss the point of why the poems were written. The poems were meant to be felt as well as thought about. When a reader feels the love in a verse, the feeling can open the mind to a new way of seeing. The risk of misinterpretation can be reduced by sharing the poems in a group, where people discuss the images together. The charge of frivolity can be answered by showing how the poems have guided many seekers toward a deeper life. Modern thinkers still use these poems as tools. A psychologist who studies mindfulness may quote Rumi's line, "When you let go of what you are, you become what you might be," to help patients see that letting go can be a step toward growth. A teacher of literature might ask students to compare Attar's bird story with a modern travel tale, showing how the same pattern appears in many cultures. In both cases, the poem works as a bridge between old wisdom and new life. One modern example comes from a community centre in London that holds a weekly Sufi poetry night. People from many backgrounds gather, read a verse, and then share what the words meant to them. A young woman once said that the line about the wound and light helped her see her own illness as a chance to grow. The group listened, nodded, and felt a sense of connection. The night shows how a simple verse can still act as a bridge for people today. Another example is a filmmaker who used Bulleh Shah's line, "I am not a man, I am a lover of love," as the title of a documentary about refugees. The film follows people who have left their homes and search for a place where they can love freely. The title gives the audience a hint that the story is about love beyond borders, not just about travel. The poem's simple image becomes a lens for a complex modern issue. These real-world uses echo the earlier point that poetry can turn abstract ideas into lived experience. By using everyday images, wounds, birds, kitchens, the poems give a handhold for the mind. The handhold lets the reader climb toward love and knowledge without slipping. To see how the symbols work, imagine a simple recipe for soup. First, one adds water. Then, one adds vegetables. Finally, a pinch of salt brings out the flavor. If the salt is left out, the soup tastes flat. In a poem, the water can be the daily life, the vegetables can be the events we meet, and the salt can be love. Without love, the story is plain. The poem adds the salt, and the taste becomes rich. This analogy shows how a short verse can add depth to a plain thought. A second analogy compares a poem to a map. A map does not show every tree or rock, but it shows the roads and landmarks that guide a traveler. A Sufi poem does not list every rule of the path, but it points to the main landmarks: love, longing, surrender. The traveler can then follow the road in his own way. The map is simple, yet it leads to a far place. Throughout the history of Sufism, poets have used these tools to keep the core ideas alive. When Rumi wrote, "The garden of the heart blooms when the lover waters it with longing," he used the garden to show how the inner self grows. When Attar wrote about the birds, he used the flock to show how seekers can help each other. When Bulleh Shah sang of love, he used the simple voice of a lover to break down barriers. Each poet chose a symbol that ordinary people could see, then let that symbol point to a deeper truth. The stories of Rumi's meeting with Shams and Attar's books traveling on caravans also remind the audience that the bridge built by poetry is not a static one. It moves, it changes, it spreads. The bridge can be crossed by a scholar in a quiet room or by a merchant on a dusty road. The bridge can be used by a child listening to a song or by an adult reading a book. The same poem can serve many travelers. In the end, poetry and symbolism in Sufism act as gentle guides. They do not force a conclusion, but they invite the reader to sit with a feeling, to taste a word, to see a picture. The invitation is the same as the invitation to love and to seek knowledge that was spoken about earlier in the tradition. The poems keep the invitation alive, turning abstract love into a taste, a sound, a scent that can be followed. The voice of the poet is calm, like a quiet river. The river carries stones, but it does not push them. The stones are the symbols, and the water is the feeling. When a listener hears the verse, the water moves the stones downstream toward the sea of understanding. The sea is the ultimate knowledge that Sufis seek. The journey from river to sea passes through many small pools, each one a poem that offers a sip of truth. Thus, poetry in Sufism is not just art, it is a method. It is a method that uses everyday images to hide deep ideas, a method that spreads across borders, a method that can be misread, but also can heal. The method links love and knowledge, showing that one cannot be full without the other. The poems act as bridges that let the seeker cross from the known to the unknown, from the seen to the unseen, and from the heart to the mind. When the audience hears a line about a nightingale, a rose, a wound, or a bird, they are invited to feel the same longing that the poet felt. That feeling is the first step toward the deeper ideas that the poet wants to share. The feeling is the bridge. The bridge leads to love, and love opens the door to knowledge. The cycle continues, just as the poems have done for centuries. In the quiet moments of listening, the words settle like dust on a shelf. The dust can be brushed away, or it can be left to settle, forming a thin layer that catches the light. When the light hits the dust, a soft glow appears. The glow. The story of Sufi orders reads like a living family tree, each branch reaching out to new places while staying tied to a common root. The first major branch, the Qadiriyya, grew from the teachings of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, a saint who lived in Baghdad in the 12th century. He taught that love for God could be found in everyday work, in caring for the poor, and in quiet prayer. His followers gathered in small groups called zawiyas, places where people could share food, study, and pray together. Over time, these zawiyas multiplied across the Islamic world, from the deserts of Arabia to the hills of Spain. The Qadiriyya spread like a neighborhood club that opens a new house on each street, each house keeping the same name and the same simple rules, but each one adding a little of the local flavor. The second great branch, the Naqshbandiyya, began with Bahaduddin Naqshband in the city of Bukhara, now in Uzbekistan. He emphasized silent remembrance of God, a practice called dhikr that is done quietly in the heart. His students carried the method eastward, establishing lodges that reminded travelers of a quiet room where one can sit and think. The Naqshbandi order grew especially strong in the Ottoman lands and later in South Asia. In each new city, the order set up a tekke, a small building that served as a community center. The tekke was like a clubhouse where members could meet, share tea, and learn the silent dhikr together. The order's spread can be imagined as a line of lanterns passed from hand to hand, each lantern lighting the next path. The third major branch, the Mevlevi order, is famous for its whirling dervishes. It was founded by the followers of Jalal ad-Din Rumi, a poet-mystic who lived in Konya, present-day Turkey, in the 13th century. Rumi's son, Sultan Walad, organized the first formal lodge called a Mevlevi tekke, where the practice of sama, a ritual dance, was performed. The dance is a moving prayer, each spin a reminder that the soul revolves around the divine. The Mevlevi order grew like a music school that opens a new classroom in each town. Each classroom teaching the same song but letting local instruments join in. These three orders did not appear overnight. They grew step by step, as a family does, with elders guiding the young and new members, adding fresh ideas. The early Qadiriyya lodge in Fez, Morocco, offers a clear picture of this growth. In the year 1150, a disciple of Abdul Qadir travelled west and built a small house near the old city walls. The house became known as the Zawiya of Sidi Ali. It welcomed travellers, students, and local farmers. The lodge served meals, taught basic reading, and held nightly prayers. Over the next century, the Zawiya of Sidi Ali sprouted a garden, a library, and a small school. Its influence spread to nearby towns, each opening a similar lodge that kept the same name, just as a family might open a new branch in a nearby village. A second historical note shows how Sufi orders moved across continents. In the 15th century, a caravan of Sufi traders set out from Timbuktu, carrying books, prayer beads, and a small wooden chest of oil for lamps. The caravan travelled south along the Niger River, stopping at trading posts in what is now Mali and Ghana. At each stop, the Sufi leader, a Naqshbandi sheikh, would hold a gathering in the market square. He taught the locals a simple form of dhikr that could be whispered while working. The caravan's presence turned many market towns into informal Sufi circles, places where merchants could pause their trade to pray together. The caravan's route created a network of spiritual way stations, linking distant villages like beads on a string. The growth of these orders can be compared to a family tree that starts with a single trunk and then splits into many branches. Each branch shares the same blood, the same core belief in love for God, but each branch grows in its own direction, adapting to climate and soil. The Qadiriya might be seen as the sturdy oak that spreads wide roots, the Naqshbandiya as the tall pine that reaches high into the sky, and the Mevlevi as the graceful willow that sways with the wind. In a neighborhood club, each club keeps the same rules: no fighting, shared snacks, and a meeting place. But each club decorates its walls with local pictures and sings its own songs. In the same way, each Sufi order kept a core set of teachings while letting local customs shape its practice. The spread of these orders also created a sense of community that went beyond the mosque. In a zawiya, a farmer could bring his harvest, a poet could recite verses, and a child could learn to read. The zawiya acted as a safety net, offering shelter to travelers and a place to discuss daily problems. In the Naqshbandi texts, members often helped each other with farming tools, shared news from distant towns, and organized charity for the poor. The Mevlevi texts hosted music nights where local musicians could play, and the whirling ceremony became a public event that drew people from all walks of life. These community activities turned the orders into social clubs that helped bind neighborhoods together. Not everyone welcomed this growth. One common concern was the rise of hierarchy within the orders. Critics argued that the chain of teachers, sheikhs, masters, and deputies, could become too rigid, turning a spiritual path into a ladder of power. A writer from the Ottoman court, known as Ibn al-Shams, warned, "When the master sits on a throne, the seeker may forget the road and look only at the crown." He feared that followers might obey a leader out of respect for his title rather than for the teachings themselves. This worry sparked debates within the orders, leading some lodges to adopt a more horizontal structure, where decisions were made by a council of elders rather than a single sheikh. A second counterargument came from those who feared that the many branches could split the Muslim community into sects. Some scholars worried that each order, with its own rituals and sayings, might create divisions that weaken the unity of the larger faith. A famous theologian, al-Ghazali, wrote in a letter, "If the garden of faith is divided into many small plots, the wind may scatter the seeds." He cautioned that the distinct identities of the orders could become points of contention, especially when political leaders tried to favor one order over another. This fear of sectarian split led some leaders to emphasize common ground, reminding members that all orders share the same core belief in the oneness of God. These concerns did not stop the orders from continuing to grow, but they did shape how each order organized itself. The Qadiriya, for example, often chose a simple chain of succession, passing leadership from father to son or close disciple to keep the line clear. The Naqshbandiya sometimes used a council of senior sheikhs to choose the next leader, hoping to avoid a single person holding too much power. The Mevlevi order, because of its public rituals, made a point of inviting people from other orders to watch the whirling ceremony, showing that the dance was a shared treasure, not a private club. The everyday life of a Sufi community can be imagined through a simple analogy. Picture a small town where the central square hosts a weekly market. In that square, a group of neighbors gathers every Friday to share a pot of soup, to read a short story, and to sing a song. Each neighbor brings something from their own kitchen, but the meal is shared by all. In a Sufi lodge, the same pattern repeats. Members bring their prayers, their stories, and their skills, and the group creates a shared spiritual meal. The act of sharing creates bonds that last beyond the meeting itself. Real-world examples illustrate how these bonds work. In the city of Cairo, a Qadiriya lodge called the Khanqa of Al-Hussein has run a free school for children since the 1990s. The school teaches reading, math, and basic Arabic, but it also includes a short hour of poetry recitation, often using verses from Rumi. The children learn both academic skills and a love for spiritual expression. In the town of Konya, the Mevlevi Tekko runs a bakery that sells traditional bread. The bakery hires local women, pays them fairly, and donates a portion of the earnings to a nearby orphanage. The bakery becomes a place where people meet, talk, and support each other, showing how a spiritual order can also be an economic partner in the community. Modern interpretations of the orders often focus on their ability to adapt. Scholars note that the Qadiriyya has embraced modern technology, using radio programs to broadcast dhikr chants to remote villages. The Naqshbandiyya has opened online study circles, where students from different continents can discuss the silent remembrance practice via video chat. The Mevlevi order has partnered with cultural museums to stage the whirling ceremony as a performance that teaches audiences about love and devotion. These adaptations show that the orders continue to act like family branches that grow new leaves when the climate changes. The story of the lodge in Fez also contains a small anecdote that reveals the human side of the order. When the founder of the Zawiya of Sidi Ali first opened his doors, a wandering carpenter arrived, offering to repair the roof in exchange for a warm meal. The carpenter stayed for weeks, fixing the roof while listening to the nightly prayers. The carpenter later became a trusted member of the lodge, teaching other members how to build simple wooden chairs. This tale shows how the lodge was not just a place of prayer, but a place where skills were shared, and where a simple act of kindness turned a stranger into a lifelong friend. Another anecdote comes from the West African caravan. While crossing the desert, the caravan faced a severe sandstorm that threatened to bury their camels. The Naqshbandi sheikh gathered the group, recited a short prayer, and instructed each person to tie a rope around their camel's neck. As the storm passed, the camels emerged unscathed. The travelers credited the prayer and the calm guidance of the sheikh for their safety. The story spread through the towns they visited, and many locals began to see the caravan as a source of both spiritual and practical protection. The caravan's reputation helped the Naqshbandi order gain many new followers along the trade routes. Quotes from primary sources helped to anchor the narrative. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani once said, "The heart that loves God will never be empty. It will always find something to give." This simple line captures the order's emphasis on service. Baha'u'ddin Naqshband taught, "Silence is the language of the soul. Speak it often." Rumi, whose poetry inspired the Mevlevi order, wrote, "When the soul longs for the beloved, it turns itself into a moth and burns in the flame." Each quote reflects a core idea that the orders passed down to new generations. The growth of the orders also led to the creation of new rituals, which will be explored in a later section on ritual and ethics. The Qadiriyya introduced a simple practice of lighting a candle at sunset, a sign that the day's work is offered to God. The Naqshbandiyya kept the practice of silent dhikr, often repeated 3 times, as a way to keep the heart focused. The Mevlevi order developed the whirling dance, a moving prayer that lasts for about an hour, each spin representing the turning of the world. These rituals give members a concrete way to feel the presence of the divine in daily life. Ethics also form a key part of each order's teaching. The Qadiriyya stresses generosity, urging members to give a portion of their income to the poor. The Naqshbandiyya stresses humility, reminding members that true knowledge comes from listening more than speaking. The Mevlevi order emphasizes beauty, encouraging members to create art, music, and poetry as offerings to God. The ethical teachings help shape the way members interact with their neighbors, creating a ripple effect that spreads beyond the lodge walls. In modern cities, the presence of Sufi orders can be felt in subtle ways. A quiet corner of a university campus may host a weekly Naqshbandi study group, where students discuss a short passage from a mystic text and then sit in silence for a few minutes. A community center in a small town may open its doors for. The modern world has taken many old ideas and turned them into new forms, and the ideas of Sufism are no different. In earlier sections, the story described how Sufi practice often looks like a quiet prayer, a turning of the heart toward the divine, and how Sufi poetry tries to catch a glimpse of that hidden love. Now the focus moves to the ways those same ideas appear in art, in music, in psychology, and in everyday life across the globe. The picture is not a single line, but a song that keeps adding verses as new singers join in. The song that is most familiar to many listeners is the simple folk tune, Greensleeves. That tune has been sung for centuries, and each generation adds its own words, its own feeling. In the same way, Sufi thought has been taken up by modern creators, each adding a fresh verse that still rests on the same simple melody. One of the most visible signs of Sufi influence today is the rise of Sufi-inspired music festivals in cities that have never known a single Sufi shrine. In New York City, for example, a weekend of sound and dance gathered under a bright marquee in Brooklyn. Musicians from Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and the United States shared instruments that ranged from the knee flute to the electric guitar. The crowd moved together in a circle, a practice known as the whirling dervish. But now it was set to a beat that mixed traditional tabla rhythms with modern drum machines. The festival's organizer, a young composer named Leela Hassan, said that the goal was to let the ancient idea of lovers' longing speak in a language that a teenager could hear on a streaming platform. The audience responded with applause that turned into a quiet hum, as if the music itself were a prayer that had been translated into a new dialect. The music at that festival was not just a performance. It was an experiment in how Sufi ideas can be woven into contemporary sound. The concept of fana, a term that means annihilation of the self in the divine, was expressed not through a lecture, but through a repeated chant that faded into a synth pad. Listeners reported feeling a sense of loss of self, as if the music carried them beyond their own thoughts. In psychology, that feeling is sometimes called flow, a state where a person is fully absorbed in an activity and loses the sense of time. Modern psychologists who study flow have pointed to the Sufi practice of dhikr, the repeated chanting of God's name, as an early example of a technique that can bring a person into that state. The connection is not a coincidence. Both dhikr and flow rely on a focus that quiets the inner chatter and lets a larger pattern emerge. In the field of visual art, Sufi symbols have become a favorite motif for painters who want to show the invisible. A contemporary artist named Aisha Karim from Nairobi paints spirals of light that look like the whirling of a dervish, but she uses bright acrylics and street art graffiti techniques. Her work is displayed in galleries in London and in community centres in Lagos. When asked why she chooses Sufi imagery, she says that the idea of the heart's garden, a phrase from the poet Rumi, feels like a garden that can grow in any soil. The garden in her paintings is not a literal garden of flowers, but a field of ideas that can be tended by anyone who wants to see beyond the ordinary. The simple language of the phrase makes it easy for viewers to connect, even if they do not know the original Persian verses. The influence of Sufi thought also appears in modern literature, especially in poetry that tries to capture the feeling of being lost and found at the same time. Contemporary poets, such as Mahmoud Darwish's younger cousin, Nadir al-Sufi, write verses that echo the classic lines of Ibn Arabi, a medieval mystic who said, "The lover and the beloved are one." Nadir's poem begins, "In the city's neon night, I hear the call of a distant drum, and my heart opens like a door that never closed." The line is a modern echo of the ancient idea that the divine call can be heard even in the noise of a bustling metropolis. By placing the old image of a door that never closed next to neon signs, the poet shows how Sufi ideas can live side by side with modern symbols. Idris Shah, a writer who lived in the 20th century, is often mentioned when people talk about bringing Sufi stories to the West. Shah collected old teaching tales, known as parables, and rewrote them in plain English so that they could be read by anyone who liked a good story. He believed that the purpose of the tale was not to teach a fixed doctrine, but to make the reader think in a new way. Shah's work has inspired many modern teachers of mindfulness and creative thinking. One of his stories, about a man who searched for a lost key in a garden, ends with the line, "The key was never lost. It was the gardener's mind that was blind." This simple line shows how a Sufi idea can become a lesson for anyone who wants to improve their own thinking, whether they call it meditation, therapy, or creative problem solving. The spread of Sufi ideas into psychology has also been helped by researchers who study the effect of meditation on the brain. A study at the University of California, Berkeley, measured brain activity in participants who practiced a form of Sufi breathing called pulsama, a method that involves listening to music while focusing on the breath. The researchers found that the participants showed increased activity in the part of the brain linked to empathy and reduced activity in the part that worries about the future. The scientists described the result as a softening of the self-boundary, a phrase that sounds technical, but simply means that the person feels more connected to others. The study quoted the Sufi master Rumi, who wrote, "When you let go of your own self, the whole world becomes a mirror." The scientists used that quote to illustrate how an old poetic line can describe a modern brain pattern. Even in the world of technology, Sufi ideas have found a place. A startup in Berlin created an app called Heart Whisper that sends users a short daily verse from a Sufi poet, followed by a simple breathing exercise. The app's designer, a former software engineer named Tomasz, said that the goal was to give people a moment of calm in a world that moves too fast. Users report that the verses help them feel a sense of belonging, as if they are part of a larger story. The app's success shows how a centuries-old practice of remembering the divine can be turned into a digital habit that fits a modern schedule. There are also academic settings where Sufi thought is being taught as part of a broader study of mystic literature. At a university in Canada, a professor named Dr. Elaine Chen runs a course called Mystic Voices Across Cultures. In one semester, the class read Rumi's Masnavi, Ibn Arabi's Ibn Hikam, and also contemporary poems by a South African writer named Lindiwe Thembu. The class discussed how each writer uses the image of a view mirror to talk about self-knowledge. Dr. Chen noted that the mirror is a simple object that everyone knows, and that is why it works so well across cultures. The students wrote essays that compared the medieval idea of the mirror of the heart with modern ideas of self-reflection in therapy. The course shows how Sufi ideas can be a bridge between ancient spirituality and modern mental health practice. The spread of Sufi ideas has not been without criticism. One common objection is that the popularity of Sufi music and poetry in the West can become a form of cultural appropriation. Critics argue that when a non-Muslim audience enjoys a Sufi song at a festival, they may ignore the religious roots of the practice and treat it as a mere aesthetic. They say that this can strip the tradition of its deeper meaning and turn a sacred practice into a marketable product. The argument points to a famous quote from the Sufi master al-Hallaj, who said, "I am the truth, and the truth is beyond words." Critics claim that using the words without understanding the truth behind them can be disrespectful. A second counter-argument questions whether Sufi ideas are still relevant in a world driven by science and technology. Some philosophers argue that the mystical language of Gunyun with the divine sounds outdated when modern societies rely on data and empirical proof. They ask whether a practice that talks about the beloved can help someone solve a problem in a lab or write a computer code. The skeptics point to a line by the modern thinker Sam Harris, who wrote, Mysticism can be a comforting story, but it does not replace evidence. The criticism asks whether Sufi poetry and practice are just beautiful stories or whether they can truly affect real life. Supporters of Sufism respond to these criticisms by showing how the tradition adapts without losing its core. They argue that the use of Sufi music in a festival does not erase the meaning, but rather invites new listeners to explore the deeper story. They also note that many modern scientists who practice meditation report benefits that match the ancient claims of increased compassion and reduced anxiety. The dialogue between the old and the new continues, and the conversation itself becomes part of the living tradition. When the story returns to the earlier discussion of Sufi practice, it is clear that the same simple acts, breathing, chanting, turning, still form the backbone of the modern expressions. The earlier section described how a Sufi might repeat the name Allah to calm the mind. Today, that same repetition can be heard in a nightclub where a DJ mixes a traditional chant with electronic beats. The same image of a rose, used in old poems to symbolize divine love, now appears in a street mural in São Paulo, painted in bright colors that attract commuters. The continuity shows that the symbols are flexible enough to travel across time and space. A second anecdote illustrates how the academic world is embracing Sufi ideas. At the University of Edinburgh, a graduate student named Fatima Al-Sadi organized a reading circle that met every Thursday in the campus library. The group read a mix of classical Sufi texts and modern essays on mindfulness. One evening, a professor from the psychology department joined the circle and shared a study on how repeated chanting can lower cortisol, the stress hormone. The group discussed the study alongside a passage from Rumi that says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The conversation showed how a poetic line about pain and healing could be linked to a scientific finding about stress reduction. The reading circle became a small community where ancient wisdom and modern research fed each other. The modern influence of Sufi ideas is also seen in the way they shape social movements. In a small town in Brazil, a community garden was created by a group of young activists who called themselves the Garden of the Heart. They named the project after a famous Sufi poem that compares the heart to a garden that must be tended. The garden includes a space for people to sit and chant together, and the activists say that the practice helps them stay calm while they protest for better public services. The garden shows how a poetic image can become a real place where people gather, reflect, and act. In the realm of film, a recent documentary titled Echoes of the Whirl follows a group of dancers who travel from Morocco to New York to perform a modern interpretation of the whirling dervish. The film intercuts scenes of the dancers practicing in a studio with interviews of scholars who explain the history of the practice. One scholar quotes Ibn Arabi, saying, "The world is a mirror of the heart." The dancers respond by saying that their movement is a way to show that the world can reflect what is inside each person. The documentary shows how a visual medium can bring a Sufi concept to a broad audience, using images that are easy to understand. The comparison to a familiar song that gets new verses helps to sum up the whole picture. Imagine the simple melody of Wool Greensleeves being sung by a choir, then later by a rock band, then later by a group of children in a schoolyard. Each version keeps the same tune, but the words change to fit the time and the singers. Sufi ideas act like that melody. The core concepts, love, longing, the search for truth, stay the same, while the language, the art, the science around them shift to meet the needs of each generation. The song never stops, and neither does the search for meaning that Sufism encourages. The modern world also brings new tools for sharing Sufi thought. Social media platforms host short videos. The discussion of Sufism often brings to mind a warm kitchen where many flavors mix. Some critics compare the Sufi path to a recipe that is too sweet saying that the extra sugar of mystic love masks the true taste of the law. This image appears in many old debates. The sweet flavor, they argue, can make a believer forget the balance that the Sharia demands. The image is simple, but it carries a deep worry. That devotion to inner experience might lead to a loss of outward discipline. Orthodox scholars have voiced this worry for centuries. In the 10th century, the famous theologian al-Ghazali wrote a powerful defense of Sufism, but his own critics pushed back. One critic, Ibn al-Qayyim, wrote that al-Ghazali's mystical verses were like a veil that hid the clear light of the Quran. Ibn al-Qayyim said, "When the heart is wrapped in too many roses, it cannot see the straight road." This phrase shows the fear that Sufi poetry and practice could distract believers from the plain meaning of the text. The debate did not end in the medieval period. In the 19th century, a well-known Sufi leader named Sheikh Ahmad al-Bashir was put on trial in the city of Fez. The colonial authorities, working with local judges, accused him of encouraging his followers to ignore the tax laws and to gather in secret meetings that were not registered. The court records describe the charges in plain language. He teaches that the inner truth of God makes the worldly law irrelevant. The trial became a public spectacle. Newspapers printed the case as a warning that mystical groups could become a threat to public order. The judge, a strict Hanafi jurist, said, "If the heart is free, the law must be bound." The sentence was a short imprisonment and a heavy fine, meant to show that the state would not tolerate any teaching that seemed to put personal feeling above public rule. The trial left a mark on later thinkers. Some modern scholars point to the case as an example of how political power can use religious criticism to control dissent. Others see it as a genuine concern about hidden agendas. The story of Sheikh Ahmad is often told alongside another, more recent episode. In 2018, a popular television program aired an investigative report on a large Sufi order that runs schools and charities across several countries. The program claimed that the order's leader, a charismatic figure called Sheikh Karim, had used donations meant for poor families to fund a lavish lifestyle. The report showed pictures of expensive cars, a private jet, and a mansion. Critics seized the footage and said it proved that Sufi groups could hide material greed behind the language of love and inner freedom. The order's spokesperson responded that the media had taken the pictures out of context, that the properties belonged to a separate business, and that the order's charitable work had helped thousands of families. The scandal sparked heated talk on social media, with some users calling for stricter oversight of religious charities, while others defended the order as a victim of sensationalism. Secular thinkers also raised questions about Sufism. The philosopher Muhammad Abda, writing in the early 20th century, argued that mystic ideas could conflict with rational thought. He wrote, "When the soul seeks to rise above reason, it may fall into superstition." Abdur's criticism was not aimed at all Sufis, but at those who claimed that personal experience could replace the need for critical inquiry. In contemporary times, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has described the Sufi emphasis on inner freedom as a form of liquid modernity, where the individual seeks personal meaning in a world where traditional structures are dissolving. Bauman warned that such a search could lead people to ignore social responsibilities, choosing personal peace over collective action. Despite these criticisms, many defenders of Sufism offer strong counterpoints. One line of defense rests on the idea of inner freedom as a source of ethical behavior. The mystic poet Rumi wrote, "The garden of the heart blooms when the soul is free." Proponents argue that when a person feels a deep inner connection to the divine, they are more likely to act with compassion. Studies from the field of psychology show that people who practice meditation and contemplative prayer often report higher levels of empathy and lower levels of aggression. In several Muslim societies, Sufi lodges, called khanqahs, have historically served as places where the poor could find food, shelter, and medical help. The famous Sufi order of the Naqshbandiyya, for example, established a network of free schools in Central Asia during the 16th century. These schools taught reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, helping to raise literacy rates in remote villages. This historical evidence suggests that Sufi communities can produce tangible social good, contrary to the claim that they are only about personal feeling. Another defense points to the way Sufi ideas have influenced modern movements for peace and human rights. The Iranian poet and activist Simin Behbahani often quoted the Sufi saying, "The lamp of love burns for all, not just for the chosen." She used this line in her campaigns for women's rights, showing how mystical language can be turned into a call for equality. In the 1990s, a group of Sufi scholars in Indonesia helped mediate a conflict between rival political factions, using the principle of sabar, patience, and tolerance to bring both sides to a table. Their effort resulted in a ceasefire that saved many lives. These examples illustrate that Sufi teachings can be applied to real-world problems, offering tools for dialogue and reconciliation. Modern interpretations of Sufi criticism also differ. Some contemporary Muslim thinkers, such as Tariq Ramadan, argue that the critique of too much sweetness misses the point that Sufism seeks to balance the outer law with inner meaning. Ramadan writes, "The law is the skeleton, the heart is the flesh. One cannot live with only bones or only meat." He suggests that the proper approach is not to reject mystic practice, but to integrate it with a clear understanding of the Sharia. This view tries to answer the concern that mysticism could become a loophole for ignoring law. Other modern voices take a stricter stance. The Saudi scholar Abdullah al-Mutahhar has repeatedly warned that Sufi gatherings can become breeding grounds for bid'ah, a term meaning innovation that strays from the original teachings. He argues that any practice not directly traced to the Prophet's companions should be examined carefully. Al-Mutahhar often cites a hadith, a saying of the Prophet, that states, "Whoever introduces something new into this religion will be rejected." He uses this to call for tighter control over Sufi rituals that involve music, dancing, or poetry, which he believes can lead believers away from pure worship. The clash between these views can be seen in a recent public debate held at the University of Cairo. The event featured a panel with a Sufi scholar, a traditionalist jurist, and a secular philosopher. The Sufi scholar opened with a story about a young man who, after years of studying law, felt lost until he visited a Sufi lodge and heard a simple chant. The chant reminded him of his own breath, and he said, "I found the law inside my own chest." The jurist responded, "Feelings are fleeting. The law is fixed." The philosopher added, "Both are needed, but we must ask which one guides our actions." The audience left with a sense that the conversation was still open, not settled. Historical anecdotes also show how Sufi ideas have been used for political ends. In the early 13th century, the famous Sufi leader Ibn Arabi traveled across the Islamic world, sharing his concept of Wadat al-wujud, the unity of existence. Some rulers embraced his ideas to legitimize their power, claiming that they were the visible reflection of divine unity. Others, like the Andalusian scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, fiercely opposed this notion, calling it a dangerous drift toward pantheism. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote, "If everything is one, then the commands of the law become optional." This clash sparked a series of written exchanges that lasted decades, shaping how later scholars viewed the limits of mystic thought. In the Ottoman Empire, a later episode involved the poet mystic Baki, who wrote verses praising love as the highest law. The Ottoman court, concerned about the influence of such poetry on the public, ordered a review of his works. The chief judge declared that while Bucky's language was beautiful, it must not be taught in madrasas, the religious schools. This decision reflected a pattern where political authorities sometimes limited Sufi expression to keep public order. The modern media scandal involving Sheikh Karim also sparked a legal response. After the television report, a court in the capital city ordered an audit of the order's finances. The audit found that some donations had indeed been used for building projects, but also revealed that the order had built schools and clinics that served thousands of people. The judge wrote, "The evidence shows both mismanagement and genuine charitable work. This mixed finding illustrates that criticism can uncover both problems and positive contributions, reminding viewers that reality is rarely black and white." The ethical dimension of these debates is central. Critics argue that if a Sufi leader claims that inner truth makes external law irrelevant, then moral accountability becomes vague. They worry that followers might justify any action by saying it comes from a personal vision of God. Defenders counter that true inner freedom is not an excuse for wrongdoing. They point to the Sufi principle of khidma, service to others, as a moral compass that guides personal experience toward the common good. A well-known Sufi saying, recorded in a 14th century manuscript, states, "The heart that loves must also feed the hungry." This proverb ties the inner feeling of love directly to an outward act of care. In contemporary social work, Sufi-inspired programs have been used to help refugees adjust to new cultures. In a city in Germany, a community center run by a Sufi order offers language classes, counseling, and meals. Participants report that the calm atmosphere, often accompanied by soft chanting, helps them cope with trauma. A social worker there explained, "When people feel a sense of inner peace, they are more open to learning new skills." This observation supports the argument that Sufi practices can have measurable benefits in modern societies. The debate also touches on the role of music and dance in worship. Some Orthodox scholars claim that the use of drums and whirling, as seen in the Mevlevi order, violates the prohibition on musical instruments. They cite a hadith that says, "There will be people who consider singing, drums, and stringed instruments as permissible." The implication is that such practices are a slippery slope. In defense, a modern musicologist named Nadia al-Said wrote, "When the whirling dervish spins, the body becomes a prayer, not a concert." She argues that the intention behind the act matters more than the form. This point echoes the earlier analogy of the sweet recipe. The same ingredient can be pleasant or harmful depending on how much is used. Another counter-argument comes from the field of ethics in business. A study published in the Journal of Islamic Economics examined companies led by managers who identified as Sufi. The study found that these firms had higher scores on corporate social responsibility, investing more in community projects and employee welfare. The authors.